Okay, everybody, on this chapter, we're going to talk about the presidents and the contemporary presidents. So, actually, we're going to cover kind of the duties of the president, both formal and informal, on this video. And there'll be a separate video that will talk about the contemporary presidents that goes from LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, up into Obama. And then there's an extra video that I added kind of in analyzing the Trump presidency. So, that's kind of where we're headed. So in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about the duties of the president, what we consider to be some of the formal and the informal duties. So, a lot of the way a president is judged is based off of their approval rating. So when we come into an instance where we have a president elect come in and take over in a new administration, they usually have kind of a broad public support. But over time, things can affect the approval ratings such as wars, economic issues, civil rights issues, and a lot of things can affect how we view a president, right? So we look at this. This is a Gallup poll that shows presidents' approval ratings historically. It was first taken during the Truman administration, and we can see here, if we go through the history of some of the presidents out there, we can look at the approval ratings that they've had traditionally. So here's the average approval ratings of, the presidents from Truman all the way up to Trump. Okay, Biden is a separate link, and we'll look at that in a minute. Gallup publishes a daily poll, so we'll look at that in a few. But right now we can look at an approval rating, and go ahead and click on this link in the PowerPoint, and it'll show you the average approval rating here, right? And it also goes a lot deeper. It could talk about first term averages. If you have a two-term president, it'll talk about the second term averages. The highest mark, Kennedy had an 83, Truman had an 87. This was right at the tail end of World War II. George W. Bush had a 90 right when 9/11 happened, and Trump had a 49. That's the highest rating he had. Obama had a 69 rating. That was right when he entered the presidency. So we go and look here. The lowest, George W. Bush got all to 25. And we'll take some of a look at why this happened. Trump got down to a 34. Barack got down to a 38. So here are trending graphs that are available. And let's go down and look at. We'll start with Nixon, because Nixon came in, with roughly a 60% approval rating. But you could see as the Vietnam War started to progress, we would see his approval ratings dip, and then we see a big fall off when we have a scandal, where we had the Watergate scandal. This will be addressed in a future lecture video. So as we said, these approval ratings can be affected by scandals, and we see a scandal here and his approval rating drop dramatically all the way up until the end of where he resigned the presidency. Ford, same thing. He came in with a lot of support. Then things like energy crisis, the economy, kind of the after effects of the Nixon scandal, we see kind of ebbs and flows. Carter, same thing. He starts out with broad support, goes down. We have the Iranian capturing the U.S. embassy. If you ever seen the movie Argo, it talks a lot about it. We see his support dwindle. Then you see Reagan. He had some economic issues here. He goes back and forth. Then we have the Iran-Contra hearings, which we'll talk about in a future video. That affects his approval ratings. George H.W. Bush, so George W. Bush's father, high ratings, highest right around the peak of the first Persian Gulf War. And then after the settling of the Persian Gulf War, we started to see a decline in his approval ratings based off of a recession that we had. Now, Bill Clinton's is an interesting one. Comes in with, a moderate amount of support, goes up and down. Then we come to 1998 and 1999, where we see his approval rating shoot up. And this is kind of an anomaly where we have a situation where President Clinton got involved in a scandal, with Monica Lewinsky, which we'll talk a little bit about in the next video. His approval rating actually went up which was kind of strange. So a lot of people believe that the impeachment of Clinton wasn't really necessary. We'll talk about that, like I said, in a future video. But you could see that even though he was involved in a scandal, his approval rating actually went up. And what are the explanations of that? We may look at this and say, you know what, this is a marriage problem and not so much a political or governmental problem. And at the time, we were doing really well in the economy. The economy was booming. We were running a surplus. We didn't have a deficit, obviously, and that was probably one of the reasons that Clinton's approval rating really wasn't was raised during the Lewinsky scandal, which is something that's really interesting to take a look at. So remember, Bill Clinton's job rating actually went up as a result of the Lewinsky scandal. George W. Bush comes in, in the eyes of maybe people on the left as an illegitimate president based on what happened in the 2000 election. So he came in a little bit under the norm. His approval rating shot up during 9/11. His response to 9/11 and some of the speeches that he gave. We created a united front here in the United States. A lot of you were probably little kids or not even around when 9/11 happened, but I remember everybody was flying flags and everybody was united at the time, and his approval rating went up to 90%. Yankee Stadium hosted the World Series. George W. Bush threw out the first pitch, threw it out from the mound on the rubber, and threw a strike. So things like that could affect how people perceive a president. And then we see his support go down, during, kind of some of these wars that we had. Get into Iraq, then his support starts to dwindle all the way to 2006, 2007, 2008, when the economy really, really went south. We had the housing market crash. A lot of people got into mortgages that they shouldn't have any business borrowing money like that. I got to admit, I was one of them. But the bursting of the housing bubble and some of the effects it had on the economy really crashed his approval rating. Yeah, Obama, you can see it really steady, anywhere from 40 to 60%, came in with above 60%, and then he is kind of the ebbs and flows. If we look at this peak right here, this is probably when the mission to kill bin Laden was successful, and then the passage of Obamacare kind of maybe increased his approval rating, and then he saw a fluctuation between 40 and 60%. Then we have Trump. Trump came in a really divisive type person. That's where we started to see a lot of, an increase in partisanship among voters here and among citizens here. We see the kind of the ebbs and flows, and Trump ended right around, maybe a little bit under 40%. Now, if we go to the next graph, let me bring it up. This is a daily graph of Biden's approval rating, right? And his latest job approval rating was back a couple of weeks ago. He has a 56 approval rating. He's averaged about a 56. His highest was a 57. Again, we have a very divided citizenry here in the United States. So nothing too surprising. And you could see the approval versus disapproval ratings here. So go ahead and take a look at that on your own, and take a look at the approval ratings and kind of the historical things that go into that. So when we talk about the president is also a symbolic leader, right? They're the celebrity in chief. They lead leading celebrity in the nation and possibly the world. Instant name recognition, instant face recognition. Fred Greenstein, who is a political psychologist, details 5 psychological functions that the president should have. So if we look at the first one, simplifies perception of government and politics by serving as the main cognitive tool for providing citizens insight to the government. So what this means is that the president is responsible for kind of making government understandable for the layperson, right? Obviously, I've studied politics. Obviously, I studied government history, so I'll know a little bit more than the layperson. But, maybe that person that is maybe a psychology major and is not interested in government, you might have to maybe simplify what government does so that person can understand. The second thing is they might have to provide an emotional outlet for expression through interest in the first family's private and public life. We talk about at what point should the president's private life be open? When should the first family's private life and public life be open? When are there instances where you need to take the hands off and not, comment about maybe members of the family and some of the things they do? If you would ask my own personal interpretation of this, I think the president's family should be off limits unless they put themselves out there. And one good, illustration is the Trump family. Ivanka, Donald Trump Jr., Eric Trump, they kind of put themselves out there. And I think that's fair to criticize them and to maybe look at their things that they're saying and maybe take umbrage with it or support it. But the younger son, I think he's kind of off limits because he is a minor and he doesn't really have anything to say about this. So I think, we have, the Obama daughters were, in the same thing. They were minors. They still face scrutiny. George W. Bush's daughters, I think at times they were off limits. But I think, like I said, if you put yourself out there, then you're open to criticism and you're fair game, right? The president also has to show a symbol of unity and nationhood. If something happens over, as far as a natural disaster or catastrophe, something like 9/11 or the space shuttle exploding, one thing that I always remember is Ronald Reagan's speech when the space shuttle Challenger blew up. I remember watching it as a kid and kind of being affected by it, right? First teacher was into space. We kind of were told to keep an eye on this and look at it. And when it happened, it kind of shocked everybody. And I think President Reagan, and if you look on YouTube, there is some videos that you could watch where he gives an address to the nation the night that the Challenger exploded. And he came across really, really well. He came across as kind of that grandfather who gives you advice that everything's going to be okay. And we're still going to explore space, and we're going to, honor the astronauts that passed and continue their legacy by exploring. 9/11 happens. George W. Bush, on the evening of 9/11, gives a speech from the Oval Office, and he quotes scripture, he quotes Psalms, and he really kind of tries to calm a nation at the time that it was really scary, right? I think one of Obama's best speeches is the Sandy Hook speech that he gave after the tragedy that happened at the elementary school, where, there were tears shed, and Obama didn't come across as a president at the time. He came across as a father. So I think that's a very important thing to have as a president, to be able to kind of calm the nation's fears and tell them that everything's going to be okay. The president also needs to provide all of us with the vicarious means of taking political action or encouraging us to volunteer. And I think this was something that Obama was good at, was, trying to get people to come out of their shell and to contribute to the community, right? And also need to show a symbol of social stability by, ensuring the citizens that they're safe and protected. Now, when we talk about moral character, I think ever since the Clinton administration, a president's private moral character hasn't been as under scrutiny as it used to be. We've heard things about, the Clintons throughout the 90s, and then the Bushes and Obamas and Trumps. Prior to that, the in the 60s, we had the Kennedy administration, and I think the news media really laid off on reporting on the private moral conduct of the president until we got to the 90s to the 2000s, and then I think it became a big deal. But then in 2016, with some of the things that we saw with Clinton and some of the things we saw with Trump, I don't think some of the moral character or the moral conduct was under scrutiny as it used to be. And, there's kind of a thing where some people might not judge a person's morality when they're running for president. If we're going to get money in our pockets and we're going to have these things that are good for us, we might look past moral conduct of a president. And the president really needs to have the power to persuade people to buy into his administration or her administration, to persuade people to take action. The president also kind of operates as chief executive of the executive branch. The executive branch, if we would consider the executive branch a corporation, the president would then be the CEO of that corporation. right? So the executive branch has what's called the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy are a bunch of governmental offices that operate under the executive branch, like the FBI, like Social Security, like Department of Veteran Affairs. They're all part of the cabinet, and the president is going to appoint the heads of those bureaucratic departments, but they have to be approved by the Senate, and at times the Senate can constrain the president's appointment powers. Congress is going to be the ones that determine the budget of the departments, but as part of the formal powers, the president also has the power to issue what are called executive orders. And executive orders are a rule or an order issued by the president to the executive branch that has the same force of law, and they need to give a directive to the bureaucracy to carry out some type of action. Now, remember, these laws and these orders can be checked by the courts. So federal court system can check presidential executive orders. And if we look at examples of executive orders, one of the more famous ones is Executive Order 9066, which placed Japanese Americans into internment camps. That's one of the more famous ones and also one of the more controversial ones. So a lot of Japanese Americans who had been here for 2-3 generations were demonized and put into camps. This was checked by the Supreme Court, but it was determined not to be based off of race, but based off of military necessity. That's not my opinion. I obviously felt that it was based off of race, and it was a violation of people's constitutional rights. But the Supreme Court felt differently. Another executive order that is famous is Executive Order 13769 that was instituted by the Trump administration. This was instituted right after Trump took over. It was a travel ban from 7 countries that was eventually declared to be unconstitutional by federal court. Places like Libya, North Korea, some of these places that they were banning travel into the United States from these countries. It was later revised, and then made constitutional. Then it was eventually revoked by the Biden administration. So these executive orders can be revoked. The president is also chief legislator, right? They can recommend certain laws to be passed by Congress, but they can't sponsor legislation. Remember, only a member of Congress can sponsor legislation. But that doesn't mean that the president can't be, maybe in a congressperson's ear to help influence them to sponsor legislation. Obviously there's going to be people who want to make the president happy that are members of Congress, and that's part of the game, right? But a president cannot sponsor bills in Congress. Only a member of Congress can. 80% of the bills considered by Congress usually originate in the executive branch through the influence of the president. We have the State of the Union address. The State of the Union address is a yearly address that the president gives to Congress. It is something that is recommended by the Constitution, but not required. Okay, so the State of the Union address kind of gives what the president's idea for the year is and what their ambitions are. It is not something that is constitutionally required. It's just kind of suggested. As, part of the checks and balance systems, we know that the president has the power to veto legislations that come out of Congress. And as part of this veto, they can issue signing statements, whether, giving reasons that they're vetoing the bill. But also, if they vote to sign a bill into law, they can also give reasons for that as well. President is also chief diplomat, so they're responsible for formulating U.S. foreign policy or relations with other countries. They can make treaties with foreign nations. They appoint our ambassadors and our other public ministers and councils. And when we have some type of maybe some diplomatic situation where another government comes into the United States for a visit, the United States executive branch president is supposed to receive those ambassadors and other public ministers. The president can also use of military force. And for those of you that might have been in the military prior or have family that's in the military, this might look a little bit familiar. The president is commander-in-chief of our armed forces. So they have the power to send people to combat for a certain time, which we'll talk about it. But in part of that, Congress has retained the power to declare war. And the last time we declared war was in 1941, right? The president has something called the War Powers Act of 1973. And basically what that says is the president can send armed forces to military action for up to 60 days, but they have to notify Congress within 2 days of sending these forces off to military action. This 60-day period includes a 30-day withdrawal period. If that 60 days is extended, the president has to get congressional authorization for any operation that takes greater than 60 days. So if the president wants to send armed forces to, let's say, Yemen right now, he could do it up for 60 days, but anything more than 60 days, he has to get congressional approval for that. The president is also chief of law enforcement and grantor of pardons. They have the responsibility to take care laws be faithfully executed. A pardon is basically that old get out of jail free card. So if somebody commits a crime, the president can issue a pardon, and what that basically does is wipe out a conviction. You know, you get maybe your right to vote back, you get your right to bear arms back, and your record is kind of clean. There's also something called a commuting a sentence, where, say, for instance, I was put in jail for 20 years and I've served 10, and the president goes, okay, 10 is enough, you can get out now, I'll commute your sentence. So you can cut a sentence down. The president is not the party leader. So Biden is not the head Democrat, even though they're seen as the leader of the party. The head Democrat right now is Tom Perez. He's the leader of the Democratic National Committee. But the president is sometimes seen as a leader, but it's not part of their formal duties. The vice president, currently our vice president is Kamala Harris. Historically, the vice president has had a limited role. You know, some of their things were basically just to, maybe act as a person of the state when receiving ambassadors or breaking a tie in the Senate. It's been a limited role. But after Walter Mondale, who was the vice president under Carter, and consequently Walter Mondale just passed within the past month or so, the duties of the vice president as far as forming policy has expanded, especially under Dick Cheney, or Richard Cheney, who was George W. Bush's vice president, and his formulation of specifically foreign policy and his influence on the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan was unprecedented. So the duties under the vice president are limited, but the influence is not. And we saw Dick Cheney really influence a lot of foreign policy issues when George W. Bush was president. The White House can also lobby, and we talked a little bit about lobby in a previous chapter. They can have liaisons with legislative officials, and they can, in a sense, organize what are some of the legislative proposals that the president wants. They can track votes, they can count votes, they can track meetings, and they can advise the president when to cut deals, right, and when to maybe compromise a bit. And I'm not going to insult your intelligence with this. You guys could probably figure out the president is going to be far more successful when Congress is controlled by their own party. The president also has the power to veto, right, and we talked a little bit about that. It's very, very difficult to override a president's veto. You need 2/3 vote of both houses to override a president's veto, right? And usually, we have tough enough time getting 51%, try to get 66%. Threatening a veto usually forces leaders of the opposition party to kind of bargain with the president. 96% of the time, the president's vetoes are going to be sustained, right? Only 4% of the time will the president's veto be overridden. And if you click on this link, it'll show you, I think there's been, a handful of vetoes overridden by Congress. One kind of suggestion was to give the president something called the ability to line item veto, meaning that if the president has a bill come to his desk or her desk, and there are certain portions that they like and there's certain portions that they don't like, they should have the ability to strike out or to veto the portions that they don't like. This was obviously something that was declared to be unconstitutional. It was a violation of the Presentment Clause of the Constitution. And what the Presentment Clause of the Constitution basically says is that the Congress is the one that has powers to have bills passed and, kind of outlaw federal legislative procedures. So if you would give the president the power to line item veto, in a sense, they're legislating, much like a congressperson, and that would be a violation of the Constitution. The president can also issue something called a pocket veto. And, this doesn't happen often as well, but it's something that can be strategically used, right? The Constitution gives the president 10 days to review a measure passed by Congress. If the president hasn't signed it within 10 days, then the bill becomes a law, right? However, if Congress sends a bill to the president, then they go on vacation during that 10-day period, the president doesn't have to sign it, and it doesn't become law. So one good example is, see, for instance, Congress is going to go on vacation in 2.5 weeks, right? So say, for instance, they pass a bill, and then they take off. They adjourn for the summer. The president doesn't have to sign the bill if they don't want to, and that bill will die. But if the Congress is still in session, the president has 10 days to sign it. So a little bit of an interesting thing and a lot of strategical kind of maneuvers that might happen. Now, when we talk about the powers of the president, sometimes we look at two types of views. The first view is the constructionist view. And it basically that says the president cannot exercise any power that's not specifically granted to them by the Constitution. Or we have the stewardship view. The president has the right and obligation to do anything needed unless specifically prohibited by the Constitution. This is a matter of, personal ideology, right? Some people might feel one way or some people might feel another way. The constructionist view might also be called kind of an originalist view. And like I said, it's a matter of personal ideology. And at times there's been instances where the presidents have, maybe put in unconstitutional measures to preserve the Constitution itself. And one good example is that of Lincoln during the Civil War when he suspended the writ of habeas corpus. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. The president also has something called executive privilege. And this is the right of the president to keep confidential communication from other branches of government. This isn't necessarily recognized by Congress. Federal courts usually don't get involved, and there were some issues with Nixon, and Nixon was kind of a paranoid person, and he used to record his conversations in the Oval Office. When he was asked to disclose some of these recordings, he invoked the executive privilege, that he didn't have to share it with the judicial branch of the executive branch. So one of the things that we talked a little bit about in the legislative discussion was the concept of impeachment. The Congress can impeach the president over what are called high crimes and misdemeanors. The House of Representatives will bring the charges. The Senate holds the power to try impeachments, and you have to have a 2/3 vote. So 66 senators out of 100 to convict and remove a president from power. Like I said before, there has been, 3 instances where presidents have, 3 presidents that have been impeached, and articles of impeachment have been issued 4 times. One was Andrew Johnson, 2 was Bill Clinton, and we had 2 instances where Donald Trump was impeached, right? So the House of Representatives will issue the articles of impeachment or bring charges, and then the Senate will kind of act as the jury. And as we saw in, kind of the Johnson impeachment, the Clinton impeachment, and the 2 Trump impeachments, they did not have enough votes to remove the president at those times. There are judicial checks on presidential power. Federal courts may reverse presidential actions that they find to be unconstitutional. But the president will also have absolute immunity over civil suits arising out of the execution of their office. So if the president is doing something that might cause a lawsuit, they can't be held personally responsible if they are executing their duties. So if I'm the president and I make a decision that affects somebody, they can't personally sue me. because I'm working within the scope of my job duties. Now, if I'm doing something outside of the scope of my job duties, it might be a different situation. Here is a graph, I mean a chart of the executive branch, and we can see them here. Here are our cabinets. Here are our bureaucratic organizations. And then we have the three branches at the top. The cabinet is the top advisors to the president. We have 15 of them. You know, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Education, the Justice Department. They're chosen by the president, and then they're confirmed by the Senate. The president can remove cabinet members at any time. And, you know, there was a kind of revolving door during the Trump presidency with members of the cabinet, and we kind of saw that, right? If we look at the California executive, we have, the governor, who is the head of government here in California. They develop policies, Gavin Newsom, right? Get it passed by the legislative branch and implement it via the bureaucracy. The lieutenant governor is kind of like the vice president of the United States. The only thing is the lieutenant governor and the governor run separately. They're not run together. They're the acting governor when the governor is absent from the state. The lieutenant governor is also the president of the Senate here in the California legislature, and they can break ties as well, much like the vice president and the U.S. Congress. So we have other departments here. We have the Attorney General here in California. They run the Justice Department here in California. We have the Secretary of State, who runs elections, the Controller that deals with fiscal issues, the Treasurer that manages the state money account, the Insurance Commissioner, who oversees insurances like life insurance, health insurance, auto insurance. They develop regulations and they examine insurance companies. They investigate complaints. The California State Superintendent of Public Instruction, who is the chief spokesperson for public schools and provides education policy. So on kind of going forward, look at this next video that I have posted called The Modern Presidents. There are going to be two of them. We're going to talk about LBJ all the way down to Obama. And then there's going to be a subsequent video talking about Trump. All right, so that's what I want you guys to look at after this. Look at all the presidents and some of the things that they did and the accomplishments and maybe the failures. And then going forward, next week lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about the court system and civil rights and all that stuff. Like I said, make sure you look at these videos that have to do with, the modern presidents. All of these are explained in that video. And then we come to Trump at the end. All right? We'll see you soon.